2 Corinthians, if we are out of our mind, as some say, it is for God. If we are in our right mind, it is for you. Let us pray together. Lord God, now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. In Jesus' name, amen. I can't tell you the exact date when the zombie apocalypse began, but I can tell you that we seem to be coming close to the end of it. Sometime in the early 2000s, zombies began to reemerge in our culture. You remember that they were around in the 60s and 70s, mostly on the edges of the horror film genre, and regarded by popular culture as kind of campy fun. You know, the slow-moving, lurching, brain-eating living dead were slightly scary, but they lost their glamour in the 1980s. By then, we had discovered what the real horror was. It was Jason of Halloween. And then the so-called reality of serial killers and fictional characters like Hannibal Lecter. The 80s and 90s were consumed with stories of serial murders, so much so that shows like CSI became the norm. We needed to know how to catch serial killers. All of us needed to know that because they were such an ongoing daily problem for each of us. We kind of expected, and maybe still do expect, to find a serial killer in our closet or hiding underneath the bushes outside our houses at any moment of any day because they were so prevalent in our popular culture. And now it's zombies. Do you want to know how you can tell that something has pervaded a culture? When you have a spin-off television show based on a television show based on a movie or a book, you've reached total saturation. There are zombies everywhere. When my children were in elementary and middle school, a popular children's video game was Plants vs. Zombies, a game for children with zombies. And when my son was in high school and was desperate to play first-person shooter games, I broke and allowed him to play games where he was shooting, you guessed it, zombies. I do not believe that it is healthy for a human being to practice shooting another human being, but the poor boy wasn't able to play any of the games his friends were playing, and so I caved, as long as what he was shooting was the undead. There are trainings available online for which you can train to prepare to be on the television show The Walking Dead as a zombie, and there are books and programs which prepare you for the zombie apocalypse. I guarantee you that anyone under 40 in this room, and probably many of the rest of you, can tell me how to kill a zombie. Right? Right? Double tap to the head. And the very English teachery question I have about all the zombie furor is, why zombies? And why now? It's the question that always made my students, and really everyone I know who isn't an English teacher or an English major crazy. Why must everything have a reason? We just like zombies, okay? Why does it have to be some secret meaning that no one understands? The red letter in the scarlet letter, the green light at the end of Daisy's Dock in The Great Gatsby, Harry Potter standing at King's Cross Station after allowing himself to be killed by the snake-like Voldemort, whose name incidentally in French means flight of death. Why can't they just be stories? Why do they have to mean something? The easy answer is because they do, but let me explain a little bit further. Human beings tell stories. We always have. Stories are our way of making sense of the world. And stories work metaphorically. That is, there is a connection between stories and real life. And it isn't necessarily one-to-one. That's an allegory, and most stories are not allegories. But it is a connection. J.R.R. Tolkien wrote out of the experiences he had in World War I. He saw great evil there, and in the subsequent war, which he translated into the evil of a great magician and an evil ring. And And listening to stories, taking in everything they have to tell us, is how we come to understand our world. I've been thinking of two stories that come out of the African American experience. One is the story of John Henry. You probably know that one. John Henry was a steel-driving man. He is an American folk legend. His story takes place in the 19th century when machines are entering the psyche of every person in the industrialized world. Were machines going to take over? Which is better, a man or a machine? John Henry pits his muscles against the machine in a contest to see which will drive through the mountain more quickly. Folks gather from all around to see John Henry go against the big steam engine and watch in amazement at the way both the man and the machine tear through the rock. John Henry wins. He defeats the machine, and then he drops down dead from all his efforts. The other story is called The People Could Fly. It comes out of an older tradition, an oral tradition, passed down by slaves and not actually written down until the 20th century. In this story, there are many slaves on a big plantation, a cotton plantation. One of them is a young mother with her baby, and another is an old African man. The mother is broken by her labor and begs the old man, asking him if it is time for them to go home yet. He tells her to wait. Not yet, he says. Then one day she falls down in the field. The overseer comes to beat her, to make her work again. She cries out, and the baby on her back cries out. She turns to the old man, and the story goes with the old man saying, "Yes, daughter, the time has come. Go as you know how to go." And he raised his arms, holding them out to her. "Kum yali, kum baba tambe," he says, and more magic words said so quickly they sound like whispers and sighs. The young woman lifted one foot in the air, and then the other, and the young woman flew clumsily at first with the child held tightly in her arms. Then she felt the magic, the African mystery. Say she rose just free as a bird, as light as a feather. Are those just stories? Are they merely legends and fairy tales? Or do they tell us something we should pay attention to? For example, which one did you know? John Henry, that's right, the steel-driving man. Why do you think that the larger culture knows the story of John Henry, who worked himself to death fighting against a machine, and doesn't know the story of the woman who refused to be beaten and rose up magically to escape, who flew away from home? Have you ever heard of the Puritan work ethic? We know the story of the man who pitted his strength against a machine and drove himself to death trying to beat it. We value that story and make a hero larger than life out of that man. That's what a man does. He fights to the bitter end. He gives 110%. He dies trying. And we don't know the story of the woman who refused to be beaten, who invoked old magic and mystery and rose up out of the work of the fields and into the air, taking her valuable child and the others who knew the magic words with her. Do you know what else was going on in the 80s and 90s when culture began to insist that our monsters were real? When the stories we told became focused on serial killers and we all found it necessary to learn the scientific ways to catch them? At the same time that the culture insisted on realism in dealing with crime, it also insisted on realism in religion. It was a pendulum swing of the entire culture. The Bible, it said, is a realistic document. It is factual. It tells real events, real stories. The words literal and infallible were thrown around as if they had some meaning in the context of the understanding of scriptures. With no regard to the genre of the writing, that is, whether it was a poem or law or parable, with no regard to the power and purpose of metaphorical language and of wisdom writings, our culture began to accept a dichotomy that remains in place today. Either the Bible is exactly right, perfectly real, and interpreted literally, or it is not a document worth reading. People either say it's in the Bible and that settles it, or they say the Bible is no longer a relevant writing. It's just a bunch of stories made up by people to make themselves feel better. I would submit to you today that both of those miss the mark by quite some margin. Now, what we're talking about today isn't new to you. This isn't the first time you've talked about the Bible as metaphoric language. But if we're going to do identity work, if we're going to examine who we are and what we believe together, we have to have many conversations about what we think about this collection of writings that we call sacred. We have to have a language around our faith. And to begin with, we have to talk about story and how story works. Now, I know that there are many of you out there who were damaged by your English teachers. Sometime during your high school career, you were handed a sheet of paper and it had a poem on it. Say, Robert Frost, whose woods these are I think I know, his house is in the village, though he will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near between the woods and frozen lake the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sound's the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Or fire and ice. Some say the world would end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. You might have had some E.E. Cummings. Anyone lived in a pretty how town with up so floating many bells down. He danced as didn't, he sang as did, some moon, wind, rain. You might have had some Emily Dickinson, which you really hated, but you knew that you could sing all the Emily Dickinson songs to the Coke commercial. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. Right? And your teacher asked you the fateful question, what does this mean? And not being a 19th century female recluse or a 19th century New England nature freak, you didn't know, and you waited for the moment which you knew was coming when she told you what it meant so that you could regurgitate that on the final exam, get the A, go to college, and never have to take English again. Am I right? We live this life where we've been taught so poorly how our stories affected us. And the chances are pretty good that no one ever showed you how Robert Frost's darkness affected the beat poets and then affected the kind of nihilism that came out of the 60s and 70s. No one ever showed you how Emily Dickinson's rhyme affected American poetry and then American music. No one ever showed you the clear line between Robert Frost and the Beatles and U2 and Sting and Common. And so it's meaningless, it's pointless. And when we hear something called a story, we think it doesn't matter. I have to get back to my notes. Metaphoric language works on us, whether we know it or not. It reflects and shapes what we believe without us ever making a statement of belief. It shapes how we feel, what we trust, how we see ourselves, and what we hope for ourselves. And so the 60s and 70s were consumed with the clashing images of a sense of freedom and the independence of youth culture, as evidenced by countless dance movies and surfing songs. And the 80s were laser focused on wealth and the accumulation of wealth and the lifestyles of the rich and famous, along with a few dire predictions about what happens when that gets out of hand. And the 90s heralded a return to a fairly blind romantic view of life, which came to an abrupt halt on September 11th of 2001, after which war movies and dystopia stories and stories about fighting good and evil and God help us superheroes all returned. Not to mention zombies. Our safe, comfortable life died on 9/11, and our stories both shape and reflect that reality. When we talk about the Bible, most particularly when we talk about Jesus and his penchant for parables, we need to understand metaphoric language. We need to understand genre. A parable isn't just any story. A parable is culture flipped on its head. Do you value a garden that's full of mustard? Would you want your garden to be overtaken so that you couldn't grow anything else? Why would you want that? That's a problem. Do you typically plant your garden and then go to sleep until it's time for the harvest? Do you make a Samaritan the hero of your story? A woman? A child? John Henry is a folk legend. It supports the culture. Yes, it says, work yourself to death. That's what a hero does. That's what your country needs. Now get out there and give 110% and die trying. The people could fly is a parable. The slave woman is the hero. The most vulnerable person, the one who has a child and is the most susceptible to harm from the powerful overseer and the owner. She lifts herself up with a word. Jesus' stories here promise a kingdom, which is also a metaphor, that is first happening around us right now. As common as a field growing its harvest, as simple as a mustard seed. They promise something transformative and radical, something beyond our ability to carry out ourselves, beyond our ability to even imagine. And we are missing out on this glorious present kingdom. Why? Because sadly, the Christian church in America has shaped itself in the last 30 years by the false dichotomy offered to us by our culture. Either we must believe literally everything the Bible has to offer, or we must reject it as mere story. Not real, like serial killers, not connected in any significant way to our daily lives or what we need to survive. I come to you today to say that I reject both of those views of the Bible. I reject the idea of a literal interpretation which ignores genre, ignores history, and ignores metaphorical language. I don't care to prove or to disprove the historical accuracy of the Bible. I am content to call it story. And what I mean when I call it story is that thing that deeply reflects and shapes culture, those elements which help us to understand who we are and what our place is in the universe. When Luke Skywalker found out that Darth Vader, now this is a spoiler alert, was his father, the whole culture reeled from this news. It was everywhere. Why? Because fathers are a thing, and every human who ever lived has to deal with their father. When exceptionally stupid survivors of the zombie apocalypse run into the zombies while they case the abandoned Walmart, why do we care? Is it our sense that the dead things of our culture, like a patriarchal system and a devotion to fossil fuels, keep coming back to us? Every time we get things like pollution under control, here it comes back again as climate change. Every time a woman gets a place on the Supreme Court, here comes a decision which limits her rights. It's no wonder we stay up late watching people shoot the undead. They're all around us. Metaphors are beautiful things. Look, they say, being a lover of God is like being a cedar of Lebanon, the oldest, most beautiful tree we know. Look, they say, being part of a community of believers is like being in a really rich kingdom where things grow effortlessly and we spend time enjoying the birds flitting around the mustard plants. Look, they say, there are some things that you won't ever understand, but for now, you're stuck in a clay jar. Trust me, though, there's more. And the more doesn't care who you are or where you came from. The more is not worked up about gender or profession or wealth. Look, it says, if God can make a bush leap out of a tiny mustard seed, how much more is God going to do with a whole human being, with a bunch of them together? The magic words of the story, "The people could fly," are actually Swahili. Would you like to know what they mean? Kumyali, kumbuba tambe. This was my story, he says. This was my story. Those are the magic words. As we're moving forward, let us not be afraid to call our Holy Scriptures stories. I based most of my childhood on Where the Wild Things Are, and much of my adult life on a combination of Les Miserables and the movie Footloose. Stories matter. Our stories matter. And don't let anyone tell you different. And as you go into the world, metaphors be with you. Amen.